Mongolia's education system has undergone major changes in the past century. The education reforms during communist times were a stark break with traditional education that was often religious and esoteric. These reforms were modeled on Soviet education systems and greatly expanded access to education for Mongolian citizens. Among the changes was a transition from the traditional Mongolian script, from 1941 to 1946, to the Cyrillic alphabet. Literacy was greatly expanded as most of the population enjoyed free primary school. However, the move to democracy and free markets in the 1990s has had some negative impacts on education in Mongolia. Though these setbacks have been ameliorated some by an improving economy and policy reforms, many adults benefit from the non-formal distance education programs sponsored by the government in conjunction with foreign NGOs. Today, education in Mongolia is overseen by the Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science. Education Today. In June 2011, VSO Mongolia published a report on the education sector which looked at progress, challenges and future priorities given the current socio-economic changes in Mongolia. The report, which was launched to commemorate IYV+10, showed that there were numerous opportunities presented by the high level of economic growth, which has brought more resources into this sector. However, it showed that as Mongolia emerges onto the world stage, the disparity between rich and poor could leave many marginalized when it comes to benefiting from education. The report argued that the Mongolian government has made an immense effort to develop the education sector at all levels since its transition to democracy, with an admirable openness and willingness to progress towards its further development. This was particularly noted in accommodating for Mongolia's unique country characteristics such as the nomadic lifestyle, low population density in remote areas, and striving towards meeting international standards. The report also showed that Mongolian people have always valued education over other attributes and have habitually made it their priority to educate their children. Due to these efforts, the findings showed that overall the parents were satisfied with their children's progress at school. However, there were still many challenges that remained to be tackled. The findings also showed that amongst all stakeholders, there was an overwhelming majority who gave a negative response when asked about the performance of the sector at present. This was in the quality of education, access to education, and the inclusiveness of the system for disadvantaged groups. In concluding what VSO Mongolia achieved in its education program over the last 20 years, the report showed that international volunteers have and continue to make a significant impact in the development of the education sector. Stakeholders who took part in this research generally held a positive view of the role and influence of the international volunteers, with 67% of respondents regarding them as having played a crucial role in education, while just over half of respondents had experience of working with international volunteers. 94% of respondents were willing to work with them in the future. At this stage in Mongolia's development, the relevance and impact of international volunteering was highlighted when addressing these challenges and future priorities in taking the education sector forward to achieve its ultimate goal of education for all, preschool education. Mongolia has an extensive, state-financed preschool education system. There are over 700 state and private kindergartens. During socialist times, every some had at least one nursery school and a kindergarten. Currently there are only kindergartens that enroll children over the age of 3. In Ulaanbaatar, there are some privately run nursery schools and kindergartens. Many offer language training, for example, Russian, primary and secondary education. The system for lower-level education in Mongolia has been similar to the one used during communist times. though the government has begun reforms to expand it. The original system included 4 years of compulsory schooling followed by a further 4 years of compulsory lower secondary education. There were then 2 years of upper secondary non-compulsory education that either have a vocational, technical, or general education focus. The expansion began in 2004 with the official school entry age dropping from age 8 to 7. A further expansion was set to take place in 2008 with the entry grade level dropping 1 more year to age 6. The goal is to have a 12-year 6-4-2 system for primary and secondary education. As of 2003, there were 688 primary and secondary schools with about 528,000 students and 20,725 teachers. There were 32 vocational and technical training centers with 20,000 students and over 800 teachers. Schools. As in many post-socialist countries, Mongolia's school system, previously based on the 10-year school, has been shifting towards 11 years of education. The official school entrance age was lowered to 6 starting in 2008. Compulsory education is 8 years. The school year begins on the 1st of September. Schools in some centers usually have boarding schools for pupils from the countryside. Many of these schools only go to the 8th grade. Pupils who want to complete secondary school have to attend schools in the AMAG centers. In Ulaanbaatar and cities like Erdenet there are private schools, though of mixed quality. Ulaanbaatar also has some foreign language-themed public schools, for example for Russian, Chinese, Turkish, English, and German. According to the ranking of Mongolia's high schools based on university entrance exam results, 9 out of 10 schools were private, while 3 were Turkish schools. In Ulaanbaatar, there are several private secondary schools that have instruction in English and Mongolian, and just a few that have English-only instruction. Adult education. Higher education in Mongolia came with the Communist Revolution in the early 20th century and was based on a Soviet model. Since its inception, the higher education system has seen significant growth to this day. As of 2003, there were 178 colleges and universities, though only 48 of those were public. However, there were 98,031 students at the public universities compared to 31,197 private students, indicating the continued importance of publicly funded higher education in Mongolia. Under communist rule, all higher education was provided free of charge. Since the early 1990s, fees have been introduced, though the government offers grants and scholarships. The quality of education in the privately owned institutions is usually perceived as inferior. There are many universities in Mongolia. The most prominent one is the National University of Mongolia in Ulaanbaatar, which was founded in 1942 with 3 departments: education, medicine, and veterinary medicine. The faculty was Russian, as was the language of instruction. In 1983, the university's Engineering Institute and Russian Language Teacher Training Institute became separate establishments, called the Polytechnic Institute and the Institute of Russian Language, respectively. The Polytechnic Institute, with 5,000 students, concentrated on engineering and mining. Mongolian State University, with about 4,000 students, taught pure science and mathematics, social science, economics, and philology. More than 90% of the faculty were Mongolian. Teachers also came from the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, France, and Britain. Much instruction was in Russian, reflecting the lack of Mongol language texts in advanced and specialized fields. Besides Mongolian State University, there were 7 other institutions of higher learning: the Institute of Medicine, the Institute of Agriculture, the Institute of Economics, the State Pedagogical Institute, the Polytechnic Institute, the Institute of Russian Language, and the Institute of Physical Culture. In the summer, all students had a work semester, in which they helped with the harvest, formed shock work teams for construction projects. or went to work in the Soviet Union or another Comecon country. In early 1989, the education authorities announced that third-year and fourth-year engineering students would be told which enterprise they would be assigned to after graduation, so that their training could be focused with practical ends in mind. Research and scholarship. Scholars suffer from Mongolia's isolation from the world's knowledge society. Mongolian scholars tend to be dissatisfied with their access to information in general, and some are still uncomfortable with online databases. In many cases, university library resources are underdeveloped and not satisfactory to scholars. Furthermore, it may not be possible for scholars to subscribe to professional journals because of cost and language barriers. The most popular ways for scholars to find information is to borrow articles from colleagues, use a library copy, or get a copy from colleagues abroad. About 83% of scholars use the Internet for research, which is about the same percentage of English speakers. The increasing importance of the Internet in research and global academic exchanges has pushed more scholars to favor English over the language that used to dominate Mongolia's academia. Russian. Non-formal distance education. The government, through its Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science, and often in conjunction with NGOs and outside government organizations, has implemented non-formal distance education programs promoting basic skill development. About 100,000 of Mongolia's 1,200,000 adults are taking part in some form of distance education. The program often uses radio communications to overcome the problem of distance. This is particularly suitable to nomads, since their mobile lifestyles are not conducive to landline communications. The focus of these distance education programs is on rural populations that need more skills than their urban counterparts. The radio classes are conducted using booklets sent to the participants and video instruction at learning centers. They are designed to help adults learn about topics that they might find useful in everyday life. Subjects such as nutrition, first aid, and hygiene are taught to help improve health. Likewise, basic business classes on production, accounting, and marketing are taught to improve rural residents' financial situation. There are courses using classic fairy tales to teach literacy, and classes on math and current events. Non-formal education is one of the only ways for students who dropped out of school to attain a primary school equivalency education. From 2000 to 2004, 28,356 students earned this equivalency through the non-formal program. Each of Mongolia's 21 AMACs has its own education and culture department, which administers formal and non-formal education programs within its borders. Each AMAG is responsible for developing the content of their programs and implementing them. For non-formal distance education, there are two country-wide programs: the National Program of Non-Formal Education Development, and the National Program for Distance Education. Pedagogical training for the instructors is taken care of by the Center for Non-Formal Education, which is part of Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science. There is a National Education Inspection Service that monitors the programs, so it is not clear how much control the national level of the Ministry of Education is compared to the AMAG level. The non-formal distance education program makes use of enlightenment centers, often in schools or government offices, to distribute educational materials. Specific projects: Gobi Nomadic Women's Project funding and support sources, UNICEF program to help children who drop out from school, Government of Denmark. History. Pre-modern times, education in Mongolia traditionally was controlled by the Buddhist monasteries and was limited to monks. Tibetan was the language of instruction, the canonical and liturgical language, and it was used at the lower levels of education. Higher-level education was available in the major monasteries, and often many years were required to complete formal degrees, which included training in logic and debate. With the exception of medicine, which involved an extensive pharmacopoeia and training in herbal medicines, Higher education was esoteric and unworldly. Major monasteries supported 4 colleges: philosophy, doctrine and protocol, medicine, mathematics, astrology and divination, and demonology and demon suppression. In the early 20th century, officials and wealthy families hired tutors for their children. Government officers operated informal apprenticeships that taught the intricacies of written records, standard forms, and accounting. Official Mongolian sources, which tended to depict the pre-revolutionary period as one of total backwardness, probably underestimated the level of literacy, but it was undoubtedly low. The earliest example of public education in Mongolia is a secular school set up by the Buddhist monk and poet Jazan Ravjar at the Karma Monastery in the 1820s. 1911 to 1921 period. Secular education began soon after the collapse of Chinese authority in 1911. A Mongol language school under Russian auspices opened in Yifyi-Huri in 1912. Much of the teaching of the 47 pupils was done by Buryat Mongols from Siberia. In the same year, a military school with Russian instructors opened. By 1914, a school teaching Russian to Mongolian children was operating in the capital. Its graduates, in a pattern that was to become common, went to cities in Russia for further education, perhaps in response to the challenge of the few secular schools. Monasteries in the 1920s were running schools for boys who did not have to take monastic vows. Such schools used the Mongol language and the curricula had a heavily religious content. Creation of a public school system. Education expanded slowly throughout the 1920s. As late as 1934, when 55% of all party members were illiterate, secular state schools enrolled only 2.7% of all children between the ages of 8 and 17, while 13% of that age group were in monastic schools. Suppression of the monasteries in 1938 and 1939 closed the monastic schools, and the state schools expanded steadily throughout the 1940s and the 1950s. In 1941, the traditional Mongol script, based on the Uyghur script, was replaced by Cyrillic. It took from 1941 to 1946, sources differ on the date, to implement the change completely. Mongolian authorities announced that universal adult literacy had been achieved by 1968. A Russian-owned printing shop, opened in Yifyi-Huri in the early 20th century, turned out Mongolian translations of Russian novels and political tracts. In 1915 it printed Mongolia's first newspaper, Nizalline Huri Nisonan Bishug. Situation in the 1980s. In 1981, education consumed 20% of the state budget. By 1985, 27% of the country's population was enrolled in educational institutions from primary through university levels. The education system, based on the Soviet model, had 8 years of compulsory education and a 10-year school system, enrolling students between the ages of 7 and 17. The first 4 years were primary education, the second 4 were secondary. Some students left school after the 8th year, while the others went on to either 2 more years of general secondary education or to specialized vocational schools. Some remote settlements offered only 4-year primary schools, after which students transferred to a central 8-year school. Many schools in rural areas were 8-year schools, called incomplete secondary schools. Full 10-year schools, complete secondary schools, were common in cities, and they represented the goal that all regions hoped to achieve. In 1988, about 40% of the graduates at general schools went on to vocational schools, 20% to higher education, and the remainder joined the workforce. Most rural schools had boarding facilities to serve the children of dispersed and nomadic herders. 77% of rural pupils in 1984 were boarders. From the lowest grades, efforts were made to link schooling with the world of work. and students routinely put in a few hours a week on useful work outside the school. Military training, including weapons instruction and outdoor exercises, began in the schools. For students who had completed 8 years of schooling, there were two types of career-oriented institutions: vocational schools and specialized secondary schools. The distinction between the two was not clear. Vocational schools appeared to train more highly skilled workers, such as machinists, heavy equipment operators, and construction workers, providing a terminal education to students who did not excel in the classroom. The specialized secondary schools, which corresponded to the Soviet technicum, provided 2- or 3-year courses at the junior college level. They trained paraprofessionals and technicians, such as primary school teachers, medical technicians, or bookkeepers. Students with diplomas from specialized secondary schools could apply for admission to higher education. As more funds and more technically trained teachers became available, the number of vocational schools increased. In 1988, there were 43 vocational schools, which enrolled 30,000 students in 110 fields. Specialized secondary schools offered 2-year or 3-year courses, and students received room and board and a monthly stipend. During their stints of practical work in factories or other enterprises, they received the normal salary for their work. The reform of secondary education underway in the 1988-89 school year called for 3-year vocational courses for students with 8 years of general education. Students who graduated from complete 10-year courses could spend 1 year in vocational schools. The 9th and 10th year classes in general education schools prepared students for college admission or for generalized white-collar work. In 1985, Mongolia had more than 900 general education schools, 40 vocational schools, 28 specialized secondary schools, 1 university, and 7 institutes. The general schools enrolled 435,900 students, vocational schools 27,700, specialized secondary schools 23,000, and higher education 24,600. Women made up 63% of all students in higher education, and girls constituted 58% of students in specialized secondary schools. Women were 67% of all teachers in general schools, 50% of teachers in specialized secondary schools, and 33% of higher education faculty. In 1985, kindergartens, serving families in which both parents worked full-time, enrolled 20% of the children who were 3 to 7 years old.